Hi folks, Martin here from Sweet Pea. Just going to show you a short video on doing the Peeper piping binding that we have around the edge of our stained glass window. So what we need to do is we need to make up our binding, and we're going to do that by sewing together our strips. So we have one set of strips which will be our Peeper, and they will be cut at 1.5 inches wide. So we're just sewing them together to make a long length for as long as you need around your finished stained glass window quilt, and add on around about 10 inches at least for excess. We're just stitching corner to corner to join our pieces. When we do this for a reason. We could just join it straight, but what it does is that it stops the bulk of the seam from happening all in one place. So that's why we bias join across there. It's less noticeable. So carry on doing that so as you've got your strips into place. Corner to corner. Now we're going to lay our right sides together. We're going to have the Peeper colour down on the base, and we're going to have our edge binding colour on the top. So the base is cut at 1.5 inches wide, and the top fabric is cut at 1.25, and we're just going to stitch it down the outside edge at 1/4 inch in from the raw edges which are met. Okay, so it's just a 1/4 inch seam all the way down, and that's how our Peeper is going to be formed. Because one is wider than the other, when it's folded together, it will give us a little piece of, looks like piping, but it's not. It's what we call a Peeper. I think they also call it flange binding. Now, I've seen that written as well there, but Peeper sort of appeals to me because it is just peeping. So we're going to iron the seam. I iron it from the right side there, and I iron towards my seam allowance towards my outside edge binding colour. So you iron the narrow strip away from you with the seam away from you. So then we're going to fold it in half widthways and press it really firmly, and try and keep your Peeper even. It's a great way of adding a flash of colour around the edge of your quilt. It's also a great way to not have a harsh binding around the edge of something which is just quite delicate, which has a lot of colour in it. It just adds another dimension. I've always liked doing this there, but it is a labour of love. So I want us to actually mark in our corners on the wrong side. I want to mark our 1/4 inch in on each corner, so we know where our 1/4 inch stopping point is for when we're doing our pivoting with our binding. So I'm just marking it with a chalk wheel. I normally don't. I normally eyeball it, but I also have a markings on the feet of the machine which you can actually line up your work with, especially if you're using a 1/4 inch foot. But this is just good practice. So mark our 4 corners. So we're going to sew our binding on from the back, and we're going to sew it with our Peeper colour up. And those 1/4 inch markings are for doing our corner turns. And you'll see that the Peeper, the finished edge comes over and sits over on the front of your work. Now, the front of your work, you'll find that the back binding seam is 1/4 inch and your front binding seam is between 3/8 and 1/2 inch. So let's just start in the middle of one of our side panels. Give yourself about 6 or so inches of free binding, and we're using a 1/4 inch seam, and I want to stop on my 1/4 inch mark. I want to pivot and stitch out to our corner. Don't reverse, just stitch out. Okay. Now we're going to fold our 45-degree, finger press it, and then fold back our fabric so as that the fold is exactly on the edge of our raw edge, the top of our seam we've just finished. And we're going to start in with your machine and stitch back. Much easier to start sewing a corner doing that way, and carry on and do your 1/4 inch seam until you get to your next corner. By all means pin. I don't pin, but by all means pin. There, I'm finding my 1/4 inch, pivot, turn, press, fold. See, I crease it with my nail and then mark it with chalk. This gives you beautiful square corners, this method. So we're working from our back. Sew down so we've got at least a 5 or 6 inch of gap. Now we're going to do our trim up. Just trim a little excess off. Now I want to fold one side back, and we need to trim it back so as it is the width of the binding when the binding is open. So the width of the binding when the binding is open. So that's one fold. And we want to trim this other side off so as we've got a 1/4 inch gap between the fold on our right hand side. So there's our fold. So open binding, that's the width there, and we have a 1/4 inch gap. So pick up one edge, fold it diagonally, finger crease it. The notes show you this more clearly. I finger crease. This is going to give you our diagonal sewing line for us to sew from corner to corner when we turn this through. So basically that's going to sit on top of this piece here. Then we're going to grab it. Don't let it go. Okay, so there's our fold. Turn it through to the other side. Don't let it go. Don't let your pieces go. Square up your corners and sew from point to point on that finger creased line. By all means, chalk it in, pin it, whatever you need to do this bias line. So it's basically square on square. Sorry, my fingers on the road here. I need to be able to see what I'm doing and show you the layout. What this will give us is a binding that looks continuous, where you can't actually see the join. My favourite way of doing this. So when you take this out, oops, excuse that, it sits flat. Okay, so there's our seam. Just make sure that our lines match up. We don't want to have a jump in our colour on the other side. Trim this off to a large 1/4 inch. I just finger press this open with my nail. And then just sew your 1/4 inch over top of this. You can give it a press before you do this if you want to. I just don't like moving away from the machine when I'm binding. It will go to the iron now anyway. Right, so there's our invisible join. So with your iron, let's press plenty of steam. Try not to stretch, but I'm moving the seam over to the outside edge. I'm pressing to the outside edge. Look at all my threads. Right, so that's pressed. Poke your finger in those corners, poke those corners out, and it should look like a little shallow tray turned upside down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my binding over and press it up so as that the top edge forms a 45 degree. Now, I come back and I pin all this. I just press this quickly first. Turn it over. The sharper and pressed point when you do this stage here, the more you work that corner and get that nice and flat, the better your corner will be. So I'm just going to put some clips in. Right, now we're going to edge stitch on. We're going to edge stitch on the just on the inside of our peeper. Now you could edge stitch on your, well, no, sorry, ditch stitch. You could edge stitch on your black if you wish to. Find that corner point there. So we're just stitching in the ditch on the edge of our peeper. You will see this stitch slightly. Don't panic. This is where you come and you just check to make sure that all those seams are sitting in the right place. So I sometimes roll that under just a little bit if I find I've got it not meeting quite right. Love this finish. So it's a very quick finish once you've got everything pressed. And it just adds another dimension to your quilt. So there's our corners. I just used some test blocks in this square. So thank you. I hope you enjoy doing your next quilt with some Peeper binding.